If walls could talk, what would they say? Sadly, the walls of the abandoned city of Chernobyl actually do. Their decrepit facades and foliage-filled cracks speak volumes about their 24 years of neglect. The concrete skin enclosing the walls of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant definitely talks. If you listen, it will tell you a frightening story, tainting the earth we walk upon, the air we breathe, and forever cursing the people of that unfortunate town. Nuclear power promises to be cheaper and cleaner than any other fuel source, but like many powerful things, if mishandled, it can bring devastation, which you'll learn if you listen to the walls. In 1986, the nuclear power plant located in Chernobyl, Ukraine, was responsible for generating 10% of the Soviet Union's energy. Nuclear energy is produced by enormous radioactive rods of uranium. Each reactor at the Chernobyl plant housed hundreds of these rods in a coolant solution. When the uranium is removed from the solution, it radiates heat, which is then used to generate electricity. During hours of high energy use, more rods are removed to meet the electrical demand. When the energy demand subsides, the rods are returned to the coolant, where their heat is safely dispersed. But just after the ominous hour of midnight on the morning of April 26th, an experiment at reactor number 4 went terribly wrong. Ironically, it was a safety experiment that resulted in the greatest nuclear accident in the history of the globe. The experiment was supposed to measure the effectiveness and longevity of the liquid cooling system, but less than ideal conditions pushed the test back a few hours, when the underprepared night shift was on the clock. Running the test at night required them to remove the maximum number of uranium rods at a time of minimal energy usage. This created an enormous amount of excess heat. The result was the only catastrophe ever given a 7 on the International Nuclear Event Scale. The blast released 50 tons of radioactive material into the air. From there, the wind carried it, thousands of miles across 3 continents, jeopardizing the health of millions. Immediately following the incident, over 100,000 people were evacuated from their homes. In Chernobyl and towns closest to the plant, families left hastily, leaving dishes in the sink and dinner in the oven. Most of these people have never returned to reclaim their belongings. Chernobyl is still today a ghost town with crumbling buildings, full of furniture. There's still clothes in closets and cars in garages. Farther out, however, many chose to stay where they were, assuming that the radiation was not as extreme. But they were wrong. Estimates say that nearly 7 million people still live in areas contaminated by the disaster. Once the surrounding towns were evacuated, a hasty cleanup began. The Russian government ordered 700,000 soldiers and miners and firemen to expose themselves to lethal levels of radiation in order to encase reactor number 4 and its building in a concrete sarcophagus. These Chernobyl liquidators, as they were later called, suffered heavy casualties. One liquidator lamented, "My friends are dying one after another." Over 85% of those still living are disabled, and their children are 7 times more likely to be born with genetic mutations. And despite their noble efforts, the hastily built structure is now crumbling and will cost an estimated $14 billion to be replaced with a more permanent steel dome. But should the project begin, the human cost would be a far greater concern than the financial one. The Chernobyl disaster has had a lasting impression on its victims. Although the physical effects are difficult to measure, it's estimated that over 100,000 deaths in the following 9 years were the result of radiation from the Chernobyl plant. The most common disorder among those who are afflicted is thyroid cancer, which increased tenfold. And believe it or not, the Chernobyl nuclear power plant resumed operation within a year of reactor number 4's destruction. Workers who were not allowed to live near the plant were bussed in daily to operate the remaining reactors. The plant remained in operation well into the next century. The town of Chernobyl today is nothing but an urban ghost town. The streets are just empty openings between empty buildings. Toys that fell out of children's hands as they raced out of the city lay abandoned on the ground. Since it was evacuated, street art has appeared on the exterior walls of buildings, rumored to have been painted by a French artist who decorated the city once it was vacant. Guided tours are now available for those who want to see the eventless town of Chernobyl, where the trees have filled all available openings, where vegetation, rust, and time have completely taken over, where the only sound is deafening silence. Author Jagan Naidoo commented that this is the saddest thing. Towns with 1,000 years of rich history now standing in ruins. In a nearby field stands another abandoned city, that of Army hardware. By the time reactor number 4 was adequately encased in concrete, all of the tanks and planes and equipment that the Army had used were totally radioactive and left, lined up in rows, resembling a metal graveyard, where the noble remain to deteriorate in their final resting place.